This Advent season, we here at Atonement have been doing something a little different. Instead of sticking with the normal Advent lectionary, we've been spending time listening to the actual stories of Advent and trying to learn from those stories some of the ways that God confronts our fears. The first week of Advent, we learned through the story of Zechariah that God confronts our fears sometimes by telling us to shut our mouths and open our eyes, our ears, our hearts to appreciate the ways, sometimes little, sometimes big, that God is moving in our life to bless us and to confront our fears. Last week, we learned that sometimes God confronts our fear by moving us from saying something like Mary said, "How can this be? How can this be happening to me?" To move from that to praying Mary's prayer, "Let it be. Let it be with me according to your word." And now this morning we're paying attention to the story of Joseph and learning a little bit about how God confronts our fear by inviting us to name Jesus. All of us who have grown up in the church or have converted to the way of Jesus know that an integral part of our journey with God is to bear witness to Jesus in our daily lives. Most of the time we think that bearing witness means learning about and retelling the story of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. If we've got that handled, then sometimes we think to ourselves that bearing witness to Jesus is about learning his timeless way of life and putting it into practice for ourselves and finding ways to pass that timeless way of life on to those around us. Those are both really solid ways of bearing witness. But there's another important way. It's a way that I think is symbolized by the ministry Joseph is called to today. As followers of Jesus, one of the most important ways we bear witness to him in our daily lives is by pointing out the times and ways when the Spirit of Jesus is acting in our lives. And in the language of the story of Joseph, I want to call that naming Jesus when he shows up in our lives. That's a really important part of bearing witness, and for whatever reason, for many reasons, we followers of Jesus have become very bashful about claiming when Jesus is alive and well and active in our lives. We're bashful about naming Jesus. Maybe it's because we didn't have that kind of talk modeled for us by our parents or pastors or Sunday school teachers. Or maybe it's because we've seen so many fool Christians abuse the reputation of God and claim that certain things are of God when in fact they are not. Sometimes they're very much opposed to what God is about. Maybe it's because of our adherence to the commandment that we should not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord our God, that we're bashful about naming Jesus. Maybe it's because it's weird. It makes us weird and awkward to name Jesus in our own minds or among our friends or co-workers and neighbors. Maybe the weirdness of doing that has turned us off to it for whatever reason. We have become bashful about naming Jesus when he shows up in our lives. And that is not without consequences. When we desacralize our vocabulary, when we take Jesus out of our language, it's a very slippery slope to desacralizing our imagination. When we never talk about Jesus as if he were alive and active in our lives, then we start to forget about Jesus being alive and active in our lives. And when we do that as individual Christians and then come together to form Christian congregations that are filled with people who no longer talk about Jesus and who no longer can imagine how Jesus might be acting in their lives, then what you have is not a Christian congregation anymore. You have some sort of weird, pointless religious co-op. That is not worth saving. And what a tragedy for a people who have been entrusted with the mystery that our God in Christ through the Spirit is in all, through all, and for all. What a tragedy that we have allowed ourselves to become the kind of pitiful Christians who only talk about God when someone sneezes. It's important to be able to name Jesus coming alive in our own lives. I do that in a very particular way, and I know you have heard this story of me naming Jesus alive and well in my life before. But I'm going to retell it, if only because this is why you have to get a new minister every few years, because we have a limited amount of material, and you have to get new material to come through every once in a while. So many of you know I went to seminary out in California. An expectation during the seminary experience is that seminarians spend the month of January in an exchange experience, a different cultural experience. And some of my buddies and I were gearing up to go to the Holy Land with one of our very favorite professors. And then this massive rash of violence broke out in the Holy Land, and our professor came to us and said, "Kids, in good conscience, I cannot take you there right now. You're going to have to go to the contextual education office and find a different option." Well, here we are at the last moment. We go to the contextual education office and ask, "What's left?" And the professor said, "Well, y'all can go down to Mexico to learn Spanish over the course of 3 weeks." We're like, "Mexico? We could go to Mexico any old time. We thought we were going to go overseas, do something really cool, but okay, we'll go to Mexico. We'll be dutiful daughters and sons of the church. We'll do what we're told." We fly down to Mexico. That first weekend there, my Mexican dad said to me, "I don't care if y'all are seminarians, you got to go to Acapulco for the weekend." So we hop on a bus and we head down to Acapulco and check into our hotel and get into our swim trunks, and let me tell you, boy, were we ever bright compared to the sea of cinnamon skin that was around us. And maybe because we were so obviously tanless, we stuck out like a sore thumb, and as we're walking along the beach, a young gal in a skimpy bikini comes up to me and says, "Will you hold my beer? If you hold my beer, I've got a surprise for you." I'm like, oh my gosh. This is the kind of stuff I mean, I know I wear my collar a lot, but I wasn't wearing my collar with my swim trunks. This is the kind of thing that you can get in trouble for. I got to really be careful there, but I'm caught off guard, so here I am holding this girl. You can tell you're not in the Catholic Church this morning, can't you? I'm holding her beer while she goes and dips in the Pacific Ocean. She comes back and says, "Here, I've got some tickets for you. I'm the bartend at a club, and if you come tonight, show me this ticket so I'm reminded, and I'll give you guys a drink," because we always try to get you all gringos to come into the club. Okay, we didn't have anything better to do. We go to the club that evening, we get our free drink, and sit down. It just so happens with a group of Norwegian exchange students who think it's the weirdest thing that they're sitting with some Lutheran seminarians from the ELCA in America in a Mexican club, a Mexican bar, and we're sitting with a group of Mexican students from the university back in Cuernavaca where we were studying Spanish. They all happen to be from the architecture faculty. We weren't practicing any Norwegian, but we're practicing our English and we're practicing our Spanish, and the group is having a great time, but things are getting so exciting in the club that it was hard to hear one another. So we said, let's go somewhere else so that we can talk a little bit better. The Mexican students said, wait, We can't go yet. Our friend isn't here yet. Wait till she gets back. Oh, here she is now. She walked in the door, and I looked at her, and I leaned over to my buddy Grant, who's a campus pastor at Ohio State, and I said, Grant, I'm going to marry that girl. He said, Hirsch, what are you talking about? You don't even speak Spanish yet. What are you talking about? You're going to marry that girl. I'm going to marry that girl. And 9 months later, not because there was anything weird going on, but 9 months later, I had the privilege of being wed to Adriana Izaskun Ranfla Castro. I could tell that story. You could hear that story. And you could give credit to all sorts of things. Luck, coincidence, the alignment of the planets, my horoscope for that evening. You could give credit to all sorts of things. But isn't it weird that when God has moved in our lives in ways like that, we don't give God any credit at all? We don't even pause to wonder if that might have been God's handiwork that we are being blessed by. I am calling on you in this season of Advent to allow God to confront your fear, give you faith for the hard times in the living of your lives by getting into the habit of naming Jesus, pointing out the ways that he is alive, well, and active in your lives. If you feel like you're unqualified, then for God's sake, people, do something about it. Come to worship. Get yourself into Bible study. Learn about his life. Get into a small group where you're practicing that language with your siblings in Christ so that when you make a wager, you can have some degree of comfort and confidence in doing so. It's worth making the wager. If you don't have a big story that you can point to and say, I think maybe God was at work in that, then say that. Say to someone who needs to hear your witness of faith, I don't really know what God's been up to in my life up to this point, but I'd love to know, and I'm waiting to find out. That's okay too, but share that with people around you. Let them know that you are in a spiritual posture to name Jesus when he shows up. And then when he does, it's okay to be Protestants. We're not like the Assemblies of God. You don't have to talk about Jesus like he's your boyfriend or pretend like you had lunch with him yesterday. We're Protestants. God is certainly revealed to us, but he is hidden as well. So when you've got a hunch, when you've got a suspicion that Jesus showed up in your life, and did some of that amazing string pulling that only Jesus can do, then it's okay to say, I wonder if this was God at work. I just wonder. Or maybe this was a God thing. And start to introduce that vocabulary back into your language so that you re-sacralize your vocabulary. You don't just be satisfied with being a Christian who talks about God when someone sneezes. You re-sacralize your vocabulary so that your imagination can be re-sacralized, so that you can look at your life, the ups and the downs, point to where Jesus is so that the next time a down comes around, you know that the God who brought you here is the God who will get you through. Join Joseph. Join one another in naming Jesus when he shows up for you. Amen.